It's amazing how much you can see in Scripture, going over the same verses over and over again, and each time there will be something deeper that is revealed, something that is new, something that has been there for since it was first written, and yet we hadn't learnt it yet. So I pray that also this time we will learn something that is old but new for us, or see something in a new way. Now, John chapter 6 is a very interesting place to go for a communion service. But if you're thinking of the latter half, well, that is true. There's a lot of parallels there. But the first half, we don't often think about. But you see, the second half gets its context, and its power is made deeper in the first half. You see, in the beginning of chapter 6, John chapter 6, and I'm reading from the New King James Version, we find Jesus in an interesting situation. Let's read. In verse 1 it says, "After these things Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is in the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs that he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming towards him, said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one may even have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, that's Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?' Then Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the fragments which remain, so that nothing is lost.'" And we'll stop there. Now, what happened at that moment? That little boy, what did he have? 5 barley loaves, 5 little tiny bread rolls made from barley. And what about the fish? I've seen photos of tuna. When you're a kid and you're a vegetarian and you don't think tuna is a very large fish at all, then you see the pictures. You've got these little cans of tuna, and then you see tuna is massive fish. Well, these tuna, not at all. 2 small fish. Now, I'm sure you know why I'm emphasizing the size of these things. Now, while you've got that in your mind, the human contribution to this is infinitesimal, minuscule, tiny. Human contribution. The willingness was what is important. What God does with our willingness is amazing. But if you think all the way back, what time of year was this, by the way? Passover, wasn't it? It was getting ready for the Passover. People were all thinking about the lamb, the sacrifice, and how years before the Lord had given victory to them. Now, what was the people's contribution back then? Now, I'm not going to go back and read it all because I realize that we've got to get to the ceremonial part. You see, way back, there were 2 things that happened. Before there was an Israel, there was Abraham. And he had his promised son. Now, after trying things his own way to do it himself and creating a lot of trouble, he surrendered to God and let God do what God does best. Now, when he went and heard the Lord say, I want you to do something unusual for me, he said, I want you to sacrifice your son, your promised son. Now, that must have been a very interesting experience for Abraham, soul-searching, making sure that he was not hearing a counterfeit to the Lord's voice. For the Lord never intended for him to actually physically kill his son. Because God does not ask for human sacrifice. Not like the gods, the lowercase gods, the spirits around him in the nations. But God said, go to this place. So Abraham took his son. And as his son walked up and he said, look, we've got wood, we've got everything for the journey that we need, but we don't have a sacrifice. Do you remember what Abraham said? He said, the Lord will provide for himself a sacrifice. And so he's up there on the mountain then, and he explains the situation to Isaac, his son, his promised son, the son of his old age. And his son lays down, says, okay, Dad, this is what God needs. Let God have what God needs. I wonder if we know that kind of trust. And the Bible tells us that when Abraham was ready to strike, the Lord sent an angel to hold his arm, and he could not. And he turns around, and what does he see in the bush? Caught in the bushes by its horns, there was a ram. You see, Abraham knew the Lord would provide for himself a sacrifice. Whatever way that was, he knew that the Lord provided for himself, and that everything that Abraham had belongs to God, and he would withhold nothing from God. Now we go years later to Israel as they're getting ready to escape Egypt. They'd been through some tumultuous times. You see, we get on the news all talking about global warming, climate change, and all of this stuff. But the thing is, Egypt saw it first. The reality of their pestilences was not man-made. It was not political. It was spiritual. But the spiritual impacted the reality, didn't it? You see, when the Egyptians were worshipping all these other entities, whether they worshipped locusts, whether they worshipped frogs, whether they worshipped the crocodiles in the river, whatever they were worshipping, it wasn't the Lord God Most High. And Pharaoh wanted to see himself as equal with God. So every contest that happened that the people of Egypt were stuck in between was because there was one man who chose to revere the enemy of souls. And God said, I will free my people. And on the very last day, something wonderful happened. For almost a week they had been there. God had given instruction through Moses that they should only eat a certain kind of food. They said, I want you to dress for this whole week, dress like you're going on a journey. Have your staff in your hand, wear your sandals, dress in your cloak, ready to go for a journey. When you eat, I want you to eat standing up. Whatever you have left over, just burn it. But don't knead the bread. Don't put leaven in it or yeast. You just eat yeastless bread, unleavened bread, because that is easy to prepare. It's quick to prepare. Whatever's left over, burn it. And they had to do one last thing. God said, tonight something tremendously terrible is going to happen. Use that lamb, take the blood, put it on the doorpost. Because the angel of death is going to come. Where he sees the blood, he cannot enter. So as Israel is thinking about all these things, Jesus takes those 5 barley loaves and the 2 small fish and does something with them. That great cry in Egypt. You can imagine the first household, voice lifted up weeping, and then soon enough the next door neighbors. Soon enough, even the house weeping, crying. We have all tasted grief in one way or another. And many, ever since that day, have a grief that comes from the destruction that the enemy brings upon us. But you know what's fascinating about this situation? Is that those who had the sacrifice of Christ in their homes, on their doorsteps, the enemy's death would not touch them. In fact, if you read Exodus chapter 18, 19, and 20, you see that the Lord himself stood in the doorway so the angel of death would not come. Israel was thinking of this. And it's really fascinating that John would make a focus of this point. Now at the Passover, at the feast of the Jews was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, seeing the great multitude coming towards him. He said to Philip, "Where is their bread?" But he said it because he needed to make a point. He wanted to teach them something. He needed them to experience faith and express faith. He said, "Make the people sit down," there in verse 10. Now, has Jesus prayed over those 5 little barley loaves and the 2 small fish? You think of the baskets. There are 12 baskets left over, right? How many baskets did people bring? You know, you've got people who say, on their way back from fishing, and the people who they have nothing in their net, in their baskets carrying the stuff, but they're going back, and then they see Jesus, they hear Jesus, and they follow. They've got empty baskets. The people who are on their way to get ready to work in the field and harvest and so forth. They're empty baskets. You can imagine the disciples walking around and saying, "Can I borrow your basket, please? We've got bread to feed everybody, but no baskets to hand it out." You know, I guarantee you 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish do not fit in a whole basket. Not the baskets that they were carrying. Now have that in your mind. Very next thing we find that after Jesus had fed these in verses 15 through to 20. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got in the boat and went on to the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because of a great wind was blowing. And so they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, and they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Now think of the disciples at this moment. Think they had just experienced something phenomenal. Jesus prayed, and these 5 little loaves and 2 small fish fed a multitude. Well, that's the 5,000 men, not including women or children. That's a lot of people to feed from that small amount. Remember, our little bit, our willingness, God can make wonderful things happen. But it's not by our own strength, is it? Jesus walks on the water. They've experienced this. They probably had been talking about this before the wind rose, but then they see Jesus walking and they're afraid. And then Jesus gets in the boat, and immediately the boat was landed where they were going. I want you to read verse 21 with me again, all right? After Jesus said, "It is I, do not be afraid," then they willingly received him into the boat, And immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. They willingly received him. See, just like that experience with the little boy who gave his little meal, the only one who had something to contribute. He knew it wasn't enough, but he wanted the Lord to have it. Whatever he had, that was for God. And then immediately, when they willingly received him in the boat, they were where they needed to be. We talk about divine appointments, but I wonder how willing we are on a day-to-day experience to receive what he wants to give us, but also to be where he wants us to be. Now, what has all this got to do with communion? Let me begin to get into this. We had a very interesting verse read in Sabbath school, and I had to chuckle because I knew it was going to be in the service. Verse 40, we have this, the same chapter, John 6. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up in the last day. Well, that little verse is attached to something far bigger. And you can imagine the disciples, they're at their destination and they're thinking and they're talking about bread. They're talking about this transportation issue. They're talking about how there are 12 baskets left over and all of these things overflowing in their mind. Verse 32. I'll start from verse 31. Jesus is talking. He says, John writes, our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And then verse 32 is Jesus talking. Then Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Now you see where it has to do with communion, don't you? See, Jesus was not talking merely about the phenomenon of multiplying bread. For him, that was not the important part. He was not talking about immediate transportation from one place to a destination. He was talking about people willingly receiving his gift of salvation into their lives. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. Then Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. All the Father gives me, I will come to me. And the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, I shall lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up in the last day. Now, isn't this amazing? You see the willingness to accept him. You see, accepting the bread that he provides is an amazing, wonderful thing. When we experience this ceremony where we wash one another's feet, we are making a statement that I am a sinner and I am not worthy to serve you, but I will wash your feet. I need the same salvation. We are saying that Jesus himself, even though he is Lord of all, he came and died for me to cleanse me from sin. Remember, Jesus came to save you from sin, not to save you to continue walking in it, to save you from it. Then Jesus has provided us himself. For what purpose? When we take the bread, he says, he is the bread of life, that whoever takes him will not hunger again. He provided himself as the sacrifice. He gave us the way of escape from this sinful life. But he said, it is not enough that I give you your 70. He said, I want to give you forever with me. And guess what? It's the will of the Father that he should give us forever with him.